Hello, everyone. My name is Maggie Vandenberg with the IQ Business Group. I'm happy to be your moderator for today's webinar, 10 Information Risks That Could Sink Your Organization. I'm joined today by Ryan Britton, Vice President of Delivery from Mint, and Jay Hall, Channel Solution Engineer from AvePoint. We are proud to sponsor today's webinar to support our public and private sector folks, including Fed, SLED, and our private sector friends looking to leverage information governance to reduce their risk. For folks who have joined us before, thanks for joining us again. And for those we haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, welcome. IQBG is a leading provider of records and information management solutions for the public sector and highly regulated industries. Since 2008, the IQ Business Group has been developing ECRM and content services solutions for highly regulated industries, including public and private sectors, that leverage people, process, and technology to support your requirements.
A very good day to you, Maggie, Jay, and everyone on the call. My name is Ryan Britton. I work for the Mint Group, which is a global Microsoft partner with a 20-year history of implementing Microsoft solutions, host of gold competencies. We're very active inside of highly regulated industries, and we've won a bunch of awards, and I'm very excited about today's topic.
Thank you very much for that. Hello, everyone. My name is Jay Hall. I am the representative for AvePoint. We are the largest ISV for M365 as it pertains to migration management and data protection. Specifically, we've been working with Mint Group for quite a while now to ensure that any of their customers are well protected when it comes to their data, their collaboration workspaces, and just generally making sure that adoption to M365 is at an all-time high.
So together, AvePoint, IQ, and the Mint Group have a methodology and a practice called Smart Compliance that we've developed over a 6-year period, implementing information governance and compliance solutions in highly regulated industries, including federal, SLED, and highly regulated industries in the private sector. And it's with that knowledge in tow that we bring you today's webinar and some of the things that we found during our implementations. The Smart Compliance Framework is represented by the mandala that you see on the right-hand side. There's a lot that goes into effectively managing information, governing it, and ensuring that we stay up to date with global regulatory compliance in terms of the way that we put together our information strategies. And our governance and methodology framework allows us to effectively do that. This is what we use in our day-to-day work as the 3 organizations represented on the call engage in unlocking that level of compliance, governance, and productivity for companies across the globe.
So to start things off, we have a poll for y'all that is up on your screen now. We want to know a little bit about what you think your risk assessment looks like. How are you doing with compliance? So that's up on your screen now. Just go ahead and vote, please. Okay, with most people having voted, 33% say they are doing much better than they were last year, and 67% say there's lots of room for improvement.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because I think as much as folks understand the importance of being due diligent with your information, that the regulations are moving at such a pace and technology is evolving so quickly that staying up to date is quite difficult, and certainly it's a daunting task. And that's a good segue into this slide. Essentially what we wanted to do leading into the 10 risks that we want to highlight for the folks on the call is talk about the changing face of regulation, information regulation on a global scale. Essentially, this diagram shows where information is heavily regulated, and then where it's moderately regulated, where it's more robustly regulated, etc. And I'm sure that you can see here that if you're anywhere in the European regions, in North America, in the major parts of Asia, or in Australia, that you're really looking at a highly regulated territory in terms of the way that information needs to be managed. And most of the places that fall outside of those red areas are on their way towards the same bar. They're striving for a bar that would allow them to come in alignment with those highly regulated territories. And certainly if organizations that are in some of those less regulated territories have customers in Europe or in North America or in Australia or Asia, they all have to adhere to that same level of regulation anyway. So essentially what we're trying to say here is that this is a moving target, but that information is getting to the point now where it's as important to be prudently managed as currency. And then if you've attended a few of our webinars, you might have seen this slide before, but it's a good one just to introduce what we're talking about when we talk about risks and we talk about liability and we talk about compliance. If you're following in the media, you would have seen several highly publicized cases of information mismanagement and the fines that have been levied against organizations that fall into that purview. And these are global organizations who perhaps can take a knock like a $575 million fine and still survive. The fact of the matter is that all organizations have this level of liability baked into them. And in a lot of cases, it's very difficult to see what your exposure is, simply because of the size of the regulatory bodies that govern information and the pace at which those regulations are changing. And we're not just talking about cybersecurity here, we're talking about information management regulations as well. And certainly you don't want to be on the side of, or you don't want to end up in the media from a reputational damage perspective if you have these types of mismanagement cases levied against you anyway. Any thoughts on that slide, Jay, before we come through? I know in your consulting, you've probably seen a lot of the same kinds of risks.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Ryan. The reality is that it all starts with identifying those risks, right? Because if you can't identify them, then you're going to run into a situation where there's nothing you can do from a proactive and preventative situation scenario, right? Even our organizations internally have those same exposures, those same problems. So we're trying to identify them internally before we then start to educate our partners on how to best address them themselves.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so without further ado then, we'll dive into the 10 risks that we've seen in our adventures in the information space, and things that certainly I think are top of mind for a lot of organizations. Hopefully we touch on a few that are worth considering for folks on the call. And hopefully the way that we've presented them and kind of the categories that we've highlighted are of interest as well. So let's get into it. The first one is also the most obvious one. When we talk to folks about information regulation, this is where they go. And I think this is, most of the highly publicized cases where folks have had customer data stolen. This is where it lies. A few other sectors that we're going to talk about in later slides. What we're talking about when we talk about data breaches is an external malicious party who get through your defenses and manage to obtain your information. I said in an earlier slide that organizations are starting to think about information like currency. And essentially what this is getting into your bank vault and stealing your money. If we think about the metaphor of money and information a little bit more. And most of these things are things that I think would be top of mind for folks on the call. Social engineering, third-party exposure, where you have vendors who are onboarded and have accounts with your organization. Configuration mistakes, where folks are not being malicious, but the environment has been set up incorrectly either because of a lack of knowledge or, a lack of care, whatever the case may be. And this is something that's, difficult to maintain for IT folks who are trying to do the best that they can to keep these type of security measures in place and to ward off these data breaches, because cloud technologies are moving so quickly that to stay up to date with configuration changes that are required in order to securely manage cloud environments is quite difficult. Poor cyber hygiene. We've seen this quite a lot where, passwords that are given out don't follow the right complexity. You can see this almost as a level of laziness. And as much as we'd like to believe that we keep this safely at bay in our organizations, the truth of the matter is that if you scratch below the surface, in a lot of cases, you can find that folks take the easy road out when doing things like creating passwords, etc. And then there are cloud vulnerabilities. Cloud providers and the cloud environments that they manage are still a relatively new territory. And so there's a lot of vulnerabilities that need to be consistently patched as folks begin to understand. And there's this cloud environment starts to formalize. Mobile device vulnerabilities, keeping devices up to date. I think this is especially important in the bring your own device environments that we find ourselves in. Remote workers are probably carrying company information on their devices. And that means securing devices not necessarily owned by the organization is really important. And finally, Internet of Things. There's a famous case of a Las Vegas casino that was hacked as a result of an IoT device, which was a thermometer inside of one of the fish tanks that didn't have adequate security. And as we start to, join all the things to the internet, we certainly need to be aware of the security implications of keeping those things properly secured. Any thoughts here, Jay, before we move on?
I mean, just that the reality, right, is here. What we're talking about are things that are beyond just software, right? It all starts with us as people. At the end of the day, I hate to say it, but we are the bottlenecks, right? We are the ones that can ultimately cause the issue. And so educating the folks who are not just responsible from an admin's perspective, but also the people who are day to day, right? If you are educated in the proper way to handle and think about your data, it's going to ensure that it spills over once you start to use software, which is what we're trying to introduce further.
Yeah, we are the weakest link. Thanks, Maggie.
Right.
Okay, then there is infestation, which sounds terrible, but is essentially about software being the thing that infiltrates your environment. Things like Trojan horses and ransomware and viruses and worms and botnets. And the popular one that we see a lot of these days is cryptojacking, where folks take advantage of another organization or another person's compute in order to mine cryptocurrency. And all of these obviously require a breach at the beginning in order to have the virus installed, in order to present the Trojan horse, in order to install the ransomware. But a lot of these types of software-based attacks have become quite prevalent, and we see a lot of organizations that have their information locked down as a result of a ransomware infestation, for instance.
And Ryan, the great point here is that, right, like you said, this starts with us as a person, right? Because something ultimately we did or didn't do has eventually allowed this to be gotten into the environment. But this is also where software starts to come into play, right? Because now you have solutions like our cloud backup, which can detect ransomware attacks. And so everything that we're talking about when we say that physical aspect, that human aspect, it starts to spill over into software. And this is where software really starts to help remediate some of the situations that we found ourselves in just by the fact that we weren't necessarily compliant or necessarily thinking about governance as it pertains to not just software, but also those physical layers, those human activities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And a lot of, as you say, we need software to fight software. And a lot of the heuristics that are assisting in identifying these types of malicious software programs, and a lot of the AI that monitors activity within a specific organization's environment and tries to identify anomalies, that's really, really important. But at the end of the day, these are evolving at the same pace that the measures against them are evolving. And so having backup solutions and those types of things in place are really vital in order to ensure that if stuff is locked down by ransomware, for instance, that you're able to recover that information rather than, trying to negotiate with ransomware terrorists.
Absolutely.
Okay, number 3, data leaks. Okay, so I'm sure you guys are picking up a pattern now. We're kind of working our way through this in a specific order. These are all of the things that are more well known in the information governance space, specifically around physical security and endpoint security, those types of things. When we talk about data leaks, we're talking about information that is compromised within the organization, perhaps sent outside of the organization by someone who is employed by the organization or is a vendor of theirs. And there's a number of ways that this can happen, but this happens more often than you would think. Things like, I saw an interesting example of this the other day, where folks were sending information outside of, or attempting to send information outside of the organization, getting blocked by email policies that said you can't send this stuff out because it contains social security information, etc. And what the particular employee was doing was going, well, then I'll just send it with my personal email. And this is a really difficult thing because they're not malicious, but they're compromising corporate information in the process of trying to get their job done, simply by doing things like taking corporate information, swapping to their personal email account and sending that information out just because they can't get past the policies that were put in place in order to protect that information. So
Ryan.
negligence, sorry,
Oh,
Jay.
I was just going to say, it's funny what you just talked about actually goes back to one of our previous webinars, right, where we were talking about compliance versus productivity and how the reality is a lot of times they tend to butt heads when they don't need to. But
Yep.
exactly what you're talking about, it creates that world of shadow IT because we're trying to get to a point where we can start to collaborate and work very quickly and efficiently, but it introduces clear holes in our security because of the fact that we can't do our job properly if we're constantly having to adhere to all of these strict requirements and these strict rules that IT has to put in place.
Yeah. And it may boil down to, we're going to talk about training on another slide, but it may just boil down to someone not really understanding why those policies are in place and being frustrated by them rather than understanding that it's a protection. It's akin to saying, I'm going to take off my seatbelt and drive at high speed without it because I don't understand the purpose of the seatbelt. So exactly what you're saying. Okay, so besides negligence, there's accidental leaks. I didn't know what I was doing and I accidentally sent an email to the wrong person that contains the list of all of our clients and their credit card numbers. There's malicious revenge, where someone has perhaps been fired from an organization or let go, and they are upset about it, and they maliciously compromise the information of the organization in order to get back at their previous employers or their current employers before they leave. There's obviously malicious gain, where someone is unhappy within the organization and is going to try and use the company's information to make some kind of financial gain. There's collusion, corporate espionage, in other words, where folks are within the organization but colluding with an outside party in order to compromise intellectual property of the company, for instance. And then there is third party, where a vendor of the organization has been given trusted access and that access is compromised. Scary stuff. All right, next slide, I think, Maggie. All right, so every organization, I think most organizations these days have used the internet in order to provide their services. So whether it is just a corporate intranet, a corporate website where folks can obtain information about the services that are being provided, or whether it's an actual online store, for instance, or whether it is an API that third parties or customers can use in order to expedite particular services. Most organizations have some kind of service or API that is exposed to the internet. And there are a lot of attacks that seek to compromise these publicly available services. Things like distributed denial of service attacks, where folks try to flood the availability of a service, for instance, so that it's unavailable to the public, thereby denying a customer access to it, and essentially, possibly doing severe financial damage to the organization if, for instance, that particular service is a financially consumed service where the organization is paid for the consumption of that service. Zero-day attacks, whereas patches, in the gap between where a vulnerability is discovered and a patch is applied, organizations try to compromise these public services. API vulnerabilities, APIs that haven't been properly locked down, and as a result of that expose the inner workings of the company's services to an attacker. Weak cryptography, injection attacks, where folks can try and put script into text boxes that are being submitted by customers, for instance. Man in the cloud attacks and man in the middle attacks. I don't want to go into too much technical detail here, but essentially we're talking about taking the opportunity to wrap certain messages or interactions and act as a proxy between the person who's sending and the person who is receiving, so that you can compromise the communication either by spoofing one of the parties or otherwise wrapping information with malicious code in order to compromise the system. Side channel attacks, where folks are able to instantiate a host within the environment that is publicly available, and that host will maliciously monitor the network traffic or intercede inside of transactions, and is essentially almost like a parasite inside of the environment that has been provisioned by the organization. There are advanced persistent attacks where malicious code and access and security holes are not immediately taken advantage of, but rather persisted for a number of years. And then there's some fairly new stuff that's happening, things like Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities, where a vulnerability between the software that is implemented inside of a browser, for instance, and the actual operating system is compromised, so that attackers are able to read from memory information that could compromise the application. So certainly a lot of technical stuff there, but all to do with breaking down the publicly available services of an organization. And we're starting to see just how complex and varied and I suppose difficult to manage these types of ranges of attacks are. Okay, next slide if you don't have anything to add, Jay. Okay, and then there's identity, and I would say, just from my personal experience, and perhaps you have something anecdotal that you can add, or something that differs, Jay, but from my own experience, I think that cloud identity has come a long way in kind of getting around the identity issues that we saw a few years ago. Things like multi-factor authentication and conditional access, and a lot of the measures that have become commonplace in the way that we interact with systems by identifying ourselves with a password, and then again on our devices that we carry with us, for instance, have eliminated a lot of the issues. But there are still a lot of systems that haven't upgraded to this cloud-based identity systems yet. So even though SSO has become prevalent, perhaps there are some systems that don't yet maintain an MFA, for instance. And there are other things that can compromise identity as well, like misconfigured permissions, mismanaged identity life cycles, and that relates to guest access issues, where someone is given admin access in order to grease the wheels, and that admin access is never taken away. Old identity systems we spoke about, relaxed passwords restrictions. So because someone's unable to remember their password or is forgetting it, we relax those permissions, or we give them a password 123 as their original password when we set up their account, and they never change it. And also lack of contextual access. So this person needs access. Why do they need access? How long do they need access for? Under what circumstances can we give them access? Those types of peripheral decision making around the access that's granted and when it should be revoked.
Yeah, and I think one of these is a really good example for us internally, right? At that point where we oftentimes love to promote from within, right? We love to pull people from one department to another department. Unfortunately, what we forget is that in doing so, yes, we're promoting a sense of collaboration between different teams because different folks are now being able to see the business side of things and the tech side of things from different aspects and life cycles. But what happens to all of the data that they had access to, right? Being able to grant access to myself directly is fantastic because now I can actually say, oh, this is everything that Jay has access to. But what happens when Jay decides to leave that particular department, right? Switching to maybe HR or legal, maybe to IT. Now we have to think about how do we best remove all of the access that Jay had to that previous department's data, right? Because everything that we're talking about, we're mentioning a lot of external, but what we often forget about is the internal as well. Oversharing internally is a very real problem. And that can be as simple as, like you said, a password that was shared between myself and a colleague because we were both managing a system together. But once I leave, that password needs to change, right? Or my access to the system that that password gave me access to needs to change. All of that adaptation has to occur not just at the external level, it also has to happen at the internal level as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And if Jay has been working for a particular company for 10 years and your access has been managed organically as you needed to do things, imagine going back and trying to audit that when you move departments, to go back and say, is this still relevant? You know, is it not relevant? That can become so complex that it's not surprising a lot of our IT departments just sidestep that whole issue and leave the permissions as is.
Yeah, and complexity aside, it's also time consuming, right? The reality is, like you said, if I've been there for 10 years, that's 10 years worth of permissions you have to sift through. I don't care how good you are at PowerShell, it's a time consuming and arduous process without a real tool in place to help you speed up that process and automate it.
Yeah. All right, perfect. Well, we're halfway through. Let's move on to number 6. Number 6 has to do with visibility. So one of the things that we've seen is that as organizations become more complex, they enable remote working, they have hybrid environments where there's on-premise systems and cloud systems. They're looking at SaaS systems that they integrate into. All of those factors make it very difficult to get visibility in a single pane of glass. But it's essential. It's absolutely essential that there is this golden thread where folks can say, I can look at a single interface or a single monitoring tool or a single pane of glass, as I said, and see uh, what trends are unfolding with regards to, you know, identities that are synced between the on-premise Active Directory and the Azure Active Directory in the cloud, for instance. These types of things are really important, and a lot of times there's not enough care given to creating these types of command centers where IT professionals are able to see what is happening within all of these complex environments at a glance. And that includes security monitoring, it includes real-time threat analysis, where anomalies are being highlighted on this type of dashboard or in this reporting to allow IT folks to engage and analyze the threat and take the right remediation, rather than being reactively engaged once that particular threat has evolved to the point where it's being noticed by users, for instance. Pervasive monitoring, that golden thread that goes throughout the organization. Anomalous activity detection. Again, we're getting into the realms of AI here as we talk about machine learning models and artificial intelligence. And it's not just machine learning models for that particular organization, but creating shared models where organizations can learn from one another by seeing the ways that anomalous activity is surfaced and how it is dealt with, and then sharing that information, obviously anonymously, with other organizations so that they can also benefit from being able to identify these types of threats early on. And artificial intelligence, even the best security expert in the world is not able to monitor every byte of information that is being transacted within an organization. But AI can sift through petabytes of data and identify trends and identify anomalies and surface that in such a way that human beings can take advantage of it. And given the amount of information that the average organization processes per year and how quickly that is growing, I think that having AI-assisted visibility is become almost a prerequisite for organizations that have a cloud component. Okay. And that brings us to the question of regulatory liability, aka compliance. So as we said on a previous slide, there are a lot of regulations, and most organizations, at a point in time, it was really the federal organizations, for instance, that really had the budget and needed to worry about staying compliant with these types of regulations. SLED organizations followed suit, and it's very important that municipalities understand what their state legislature is and how they adhere to that. And then, highly regulated industries such as educational industries and healthcare and oil and gas and financial institutions and so forth have also had to invest a large amount of money into making sure that they stay compliant and keep down their liability in terms of these types of regulations. But these days, I would say it's getting to the point where there isn't an organization that can afford not to look at these things. And unfortunately, this is just a subset. I mean, there are hundreds of regulations. Some of them are industry specific, some of them are region specific, some of them are state specific, some of them are federal. And when they roll up, and for an organization to be able to say with confidence, our level of compliance is X, and here are the attestations that prove that we're at that level of compliance. And here is how we measure that a level of compliance on a continual basis. That is really tough. But the fact of the matter is that if you don't know what your level of compliance is, you don't know what your level of liability is. And so this is becoming a really big issue for organizations as they seek to understand what their exposure is and deal with it adequately. Okay, next slide. So the next one is something that is not obvious, I would say, to a lot of organizations, and that is the lack of storage structure. At a point in time, organizations had a file server, and if you threw enough drives in it and you had good backups, then that was okay, and you could kind of let folks figure out their folder structure on their own. And unfortunately, what that's led to is there are a lot of organizations out there who have terabytes or petabytes of data that has grown organically over 10 or 20 years that is very difficult to mine and understand what type of information sits in what type of folder. And I think that file servers were a lot more forgiving than our modern cloud environments, because in order to do an e-discovery request on file servers was a lot of man hours invested and imperfect results coming back. But if you take all of that information and you move it to the cloud and you go to a Microsoft 365 search and you type in a case number, or you type in a product code, or you type in a product name, you're going to get back all of the information that exists throughout the organization that matches that search query. And that's going to come from people's personal OneDrives, files that they've copied to their OneDrives that may be sitting on their laptops. And that represents significant exposure. And what that means is that organizations are having to turn around and change the way that they structure that storage. Things that we see as we do our consulting is a lack of taxonomy, a lack of understanding that under the finance department, these are the types of information that we work with. Under the engineering department, these are the types of documents that are important. And in a lot of cases, there may be a taxonomy, but it only exists in the compliance department or in the records department. And folks have this mindset that during the collaboration phase of the information lifecycle, stuff just happens organically and it's a mess and we acknowledge it. But when it crosses over into the compliance officer's realm or the records manager's realm, it's then that we want to try and apply this taxonomy and understand the types of information. And the fact of the matter is that we need to structure the entire organization this way. We need to be thinking about the types of information that we have and how we classify it as early on as possible so that we can manage it effectively. Lack of structured information environment, that boils down to how we develop our intranet, for lack of a better word. If your information is stored there, it should be stored in a structured way. Folks should be able to discover it and you should be able to manage it. Organically grown file systems we've spoken about, and old file storage technologies are a problem as well, where as you move those technologies to the cloud, first of all, the nature of the information changes, but also these old file technologies are starting to become deprecated and they're starting to fail. Outdated, non-existent or unenforced record schedules, it goes back to lack of taxonomy, the problem with having two worlds inside of the organization, one where productivity is and content development is king, and the other where compliance and regulation is king, is that it becomes very difficult to enforce your record schedules, because how do you know inside of the SharePoint environment that all of the information that needs to be declared as a record is being done that way? You might have 800 teams, and it may be very difficult to determine what the information is inside of those teams or workspaces from a compliance perspective. And then lack of an effective archiving strategy or system. One of the things that will happen as you move information to the cloud is that you'll realize that space is limited in the cloud and space is expensive in the cloud. And so it becomes important to have an archiving strategy where you age your information and you start to move things to less costly storage at a certain stage of its life cycle without compromising its accessibility. And then finally, a lack of backup strategy system as well. And this goes to understanding what your cloud provider's SLA says and what they cover and what they don't cover. And once you understand what those gaps are, most organizations realize that it's really important to have a backup strategy, even for cloud information. Cloud information is resilient in terms of failure, but if someone runs a PowerShell script as an administrator and corrupts all of the information within a particular SharePoint site, you need to be able to roll that back.
And I think one thing here, Ryan, that I just kind of wanted to harp on is that understanding that all of these things, they require different solutions, but they're all part of the same type of strategy, right? How do we make sure that data is structured in such a meaningful way that you are both utilizing the correct type of storage, keeping costs down, but simultaneously making sure that you have the right tool set available to you in the event that something goes wrong, right? Microsoft switching your licensing model to annual means that you need to keep in mind what type of licenses you have. When it comes to storage, you need to think about, well, if we go over the Microsoft quota, what are we going to do with that data, right? I have a conversation with the customer I'm dealing with today where exactly that's happening. And needing an effective archiving solution means that that solution has to be able to meet the targeted criteria so that only the correct data gets removed from M365, but at the same time ensures that moving forward, they'll be able to do this on a continuous basis to keep them protected and ensure that their costs stay fairly minimal.
Yeah, great points all around, Jay. And again, you know, it's so difficult to get any of that right if you don't know what information you're dealing with. If you don't know what the difference is between your lunch menu and the corporate contract, simply because they're both Word documents. And once you do understand that, you'll probably find that the way that your archiving works is sensitive to the type of information that you're archiving. All right, next slide. I think we have about 20 minutes left. Yeah. Okay, then lack of process governance. So even if you have taken the time and invested the strategy into structuring your storage in such a way that your storage ecosystem is well constructed, you have good archiving systems in place, you have backups in place, you understand what information sits where within your organization, you then need to think about how that information changes and what that process looks like and how you govern that process. What we're talking about here is document lifecycle management. understanding when a document is created, the context under which it happens, who has access to it at the outset, how it's versioned, how it gets distributed, when it's shared, how that works, how long is the sharing enabled for, whether there is a publication of that information to a specifically to a wider audience, perhaps it's posted on the internet for all employees to consume. And then finally, how it becomes a record, how it is retained, and how it is destroyed. And understanding that for all of your critical information really gives you the power to manage the life cycle throughout, and also gives you the ability to do so within the collaboration environment like SharePoint, as well as your records environment. Team lifecycle management is a follow-on from that. Nowadays, the way that we work with information is very different from where it was 10 years ago and where it was pre-pandemic. We need to understand how teams are formed, the type of information that's put inside of a team, how it's shared within that team, whether there are vendors or guests on that team, how that team gets off-boarded and destroyed or archived or retained once it is no longer needed, and when it is no longer needed. And all of those things are complex life cycle questions that have to be asked up front. And essentially what it points to is that we need to design our teams intelligently so that we're able to manage them effectively. Because certainly if you're sitting with 800 teams and the IT department is tasked with managing them, but they don't know what's in those teams, whether they can delete them, how long they will be needed, whether they are still needed. Those questions are very difficult for an IT department who's not involved in the team to answer. And then following on from that, things like sharing access management, how to revoke sharing rights at the appropriate moment when a vendor no longer needs access to a site, for instance. I have an anecdote with a customer where they had a particular Microsoft Teams instance, and at a point in time, a vendor was added to it because the vendor needed access to certain information, and then everyone forgot that the vendor had access. Fast forward 3 years down the line, everyone is posting internal conversations on the posts thread. There is additional documentation that has been added to that team, and essentially this vendor has access to all of that. Those are the type of scary situations that we need to try and avoid when building out these teams environments and understanding the document life cycles that are managed within those teams. Every business unit has different processes, and we need to be sensitive to that. Thinking that you can paint the entire organization with a single brush and set aside a single process for managing information is not going to work. There will be an ill fit for every business unit inside of your organization because they all work with information in a very different manner. And then things like onboarding and offboarding processes. How do you enforce policies? It's good enough to say, well, this is what the policy is. How do you enforce that? How do you stop people from going against your sharing policy by simply doing that in a fashion that is, perhaps not governable by the baseline Microsoft 365 tenant? And then document classification. How do you classify documents automatically so that people don't have to? Because if you're relying on people to classify information, you will be sorely disappointed. And then things like ingress and egress management of information, leaving the organization and coming into the organization. Lots to think about. Any thoughts here, Jay? Or
No, I mean, the reality is, right, like everything that you're talking about is how can governance ultimately be applied in such a way that it is going to limit the requirement for end users to have to be complicit while simultaneously ensuring that all of the policies you put in place are actually meaningful, right? Because you can put as many policies as you want, but if they don't have a true purpose, right? If they aren't tailored specific to the business unit, to the department, or to a specific industry standard like HIPAA compliance that you have to adhere to, then it might be time to reevaluate what your actual governance process is.
yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, I think let's move on to this slide rather than hop on there. Essentially, what we'll find is that as you said in a previous slide, Jay, in a lot of cases we are the weakest link, and unfortunately, we spend so much time investing in technology that sometimes we forget to invest in the people coming along for the ride. And we find that in a lot of cases, we'll implement a new system, IT department will roll it out, And after the fact, there is perhaps 1 or 2 training days to bring the organization up to speed. But I think one of the things that we've recognized in our consulting efforts in a lot of organizations that have wrestled with how to successfully implement these types of information governance and compliance measures is that folks need to be advocates. They need to be involved from the start. You can't underestimate the need for proper change management, and that folks need proper and adequate product training. From the baseline, how to use Teams, how to use OneNote, all the way up to how does my third-party application integrate with Microsoft 365? Things like cybersecurity training. And I've seen a lot of this recently where organizations are looking at training folks to identify how their actions could be compromising the organization simply because the emails that they're receiving are not coming from trusted sources. And it's so easy to fall into a pattern where you get an email, it seems legit, you don't notice that it's coming from a different email address, and as a result of that, you click on a link that compromises the entire organization. It's that serious. Informational management training. Now, not talking about understanding how to protect information, but talking about how to categorize, how to organize, how to do that within my own business unit, how to manage information in such a way that I can pass it off to the records management or compliance team at a point in time. And in a lot of cases, there may be an expectation. It's up to this business unit to declare their records and to ship those records across to the records department. But they may not be compliant simply because they don't advocate it, they don't understand why it's necessary, and they haven't been properly trained. Device training, how to use your device in such a way that is secure. Change management we spoke about. Can't emphasize enough how organizations can have a fantastic technical solution and it's been implemented in such a way that folks don't understand the purpose of it and they can't use it. Things like managing adoption. And essentially the last point here, what we're talking about here is a culture shift. We're talking about people treating information the way they treat money. And that means that we have to get past this point where it's okay to leave documents lying around and copy them into a dozen places and not think about version control. And we need to get better at the way that we think about information and how we value information and how we manage information.
Okay, we've got another poll for you guys. I'm going to pop that up on your screen now. Tell us a little bit about whether or not the risks we've talked about today were things that were on your radar, not on your radar. That is up on your screens now. Go ahead and vote. Okay, with most people having voted, 50% say not all of the things that we talked about today were on their radar, and 50% say that there are some things that they missed.
Interesting. I'd be very, very keen to hear the things that we missed. Okay. All right, so diving straight in, here are some of the things that you can do in order to try and remediate some of those risks. These are just some thoughts in a structured pattern that come from our consulting and dealing with these risks on a day-to-day basis. I don't think any of them should be a surprise. Certainly, if you've watched some of our previous webinars, they shouldn't be. We're saying the same things over and over again about how to tackle certain information problems because there is a methodology behind this and there is an approach that really works. And it is a layered approach that builds on top of itself. In this case, it starts with making sure that you have a best practice M365 tenant. And this can be difficult to get to actually, because in a lot of cases, when you're rolling out Microsoft technologies, it is happening in pockets. There is a vendor that comes in and activates Teams and rolls it out. And there's a vendor that comes in and migrates your Active Directory. And there's another team that comes in and sets up SharePoint. And there's one that comes in and migrates your data. And with all of these things happening, actually creating a consolidated configuration that aligns with the company's policies is something that can fall by the wayside. And it's worth investing in to ensure that all of the right policies are in place and that you have a best practice M365 tenant in order to start from as a baseline. And there are actually some technologies out there that can assist, that will monitor and look at the configuration of a tenant and try to highlight risks and try to highlight configurations that may be awry. Next one.
So I think in this case, Brian, right, what we're really trying to get at here is that it takes a village, right? It takes a suite of solutions to make sure that you stay not only in compliance, but that you have the right governance tools, backup solutions, and archival solutions to really make your data protected, right? And so all of the solutions that we're talking about here, they speak to exactly what Mint Group and AvePoint are trying to bring to your team in order to ensure that you can make sure that your data is protected, that you have insight and visibility into that data. You're able to proactively put controls in place to limit the oversharing or sensitive information that might be exposed to external users or even internal users. And then finally, being able to ensure that the right data is living in the right location, right? Whether that's in M365 or being pulled out by an archival solution, whether that's being backed up to an M365 Azure data center to ensure that you can protect yourself from ransomware attacks, or even just the provisioning and management, right? Saying forget talking about backup and protection. Let's talk about the proactive controls we can put in place to keep users from doing that sprawl, from keeping users from doing things like oversharing, right? All of these components together create that conversation and story of how do we protect our organization? How do we protect our users? How do we empower admins? And how do we ensure that everyone together is keeping all of this in mind to ensure that there is no potential risk, or at least mitigating the impact of such a risk?
Yeah, and something that I can add to that, Jay, and it's a shameless plug for you guys, but before Mint and AvePoint started working together on these types of solutions together, we were trying to implement some of these things with consulting hours, trying to configure the M365 tenant in such a way that it aligns with corporate policies, et cetera, et cetera. And M365 is a fantastic platform for productivity, for collaboration. Microsoft has done a fantastic job in rolling it out, but it's a generalist. And in order to get from there to a specialized platform that suits an organization within a particular need, you can put consulting hours up in order to get there. But I would say that it certainly made our lives a lot easier to use products like the AvePoint set of solutions, and more cost effective for our clients to get there in terms of putting down that best practice platform.
Love to hear it.
Okay, next slide. One of the things that folks should look at is how they structure their Microsoft 365 tenant and their information ecosystem. In a lot of cases, there is no division between the types of spaces. And when we talk about spaces here, we're talking about team sites and SharePoint sites that folks will create. Some of them are created for a project-specific reason. Some are created for distinct groups of users in a team space. Others represent communities. And really, if you think about it, these types of teams should have different access permissions, different ways of being archived, different usage policies. And so it really behooves an organization to go through the process of architecting. What does this look like? What does my information landscape look like in terms of the types of workspaces that exist, how they get created, how people have access to them, whether or not guest access is allowed, all of these types of things. In this, the diagram, for instance, on the far right-hand side, you can see that there is an extranet space, an allocated part of the information ecosystem where it's okay to have vendors as members and to share certain information. And having this demarcated makes it much easier to apply policies and to understand what type of access you're giving away when you create a workspace of this type. Okay, next slide. We've got about 6 minutes left. Design your information taxonomy. So this leads on from one of the risks that we saw. This is not an exercise for records managers and compliance officers alone. We're talking about doing this for the entire organization for the sake of collaboration too, and starting to think about information life cycles as starting when an employee creates a Word document with the intent of creating a document of a certain type. Understanding your business units, understanding the types of information that they work with will allow you to ring fence your critical business data. And normally that's only 12% of the information floating around the organization, but it's the 12% that you want to manage, you want to have a life cycle for, and you certainly want to know its whereabouts as they are moved across the organization. Okay, plan your team collaboration workspaces. Same thing as with your document works or your taxonomy. We're talking about a taxonomy of teams here. Within certain departments, there are going to be certain types of teams. Some of them will be departmental teams that exist for as long as the department exists. Others will be centered around an opportunity in sales, for instance. And once that opportunity has been closed or lost, the team is no longer needed. Some will be project specific and some will be centered around a case. I'm sure you can see that as we start to think our way through the types of teams we're using, there is a good opportunity to start to build out what these life cycles will look like and manage these teams very effectively in terms of the way that they're created, onboarded, managed, and when they are sunsetted. Next slide. Okay.
And so everything,
yeah.
yeah, Brian, I was just going to say everything that you were just talking about in those last two sides, right? They really culminate here in your information and government framework, right? Or essentially, how do we think about what each individual department needs as it pertains to things like sharing, whether or not those collaboration workspaces need to exist for the same amount of time and or differentiating periods and times, whether or not those actual collaboration workspaces should be created by the same users, whether that's a central IT team versus maybe department heads versus maybe only specific admins who are tier one admins responsible for collaboration workspace and creation. All of that culminates then in recertification and ensuring that the right folks have access to this data for the right period, right? You had an anecdote previously where you were talking about someone created a collaboration workspace. They gave an external user access, but then at the same time, everyone forgot about it for 3 years and they started using it net new normally, right? Having a recertification process in place that revalidates what members are a part of this would have ensured that automatically after 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months, that external user would have been removed. Or at the bare minimum, that collaboration workspace might have been repurposed for something different other than using it for internal documentation.
Yep. Right, and then we've already said a lot about instigating a culture shift, and I'm not going to go through this slide bit by bit in the interests of time, but to summarize it, this seems like the softer issues. This seems ancillary to the implementation of the technology. This seems like the things that you know don't require as much investment. But from experience, this is where the battle is won or lost. It really the organizations that have really been successful in implementing good productivity, information governance, and compliance strategies within their environments have focused their efforts on the change, on the people, on identifying advocates, on creating communities and embedding the need for change into those communities. And essentially doing that means that this becomes less of a technology implementation and more of a culture shift. And it's something that I can't underline the importance of enough.
And this is just a sample, right? This is just a preview of what kind of information you're going to need in order to really have an effective framework from governance and from data management. Being able to utilize a solution like AvePoint's insights for M365, it gives you the peace of mind of knowing that regardless of whether you're exposed in Teams or SharePoint or OneDrive or groups, you have a report that specifically is dedicated to isolating and then giving you focused information on that collaboration workspace type. Meaning you don't have to inundate your admins with information about every single collaboration workspace. Instead, only the silos that they're responsible for, they'll get a report specifically on that, right? So it allows your turnaround time for not only implementation of governance, but more importantly, giving you actionable intel. It will actually be much faster because you're only focusing on that which is most important to you, which tools that have that automation in place can help provide for you without the need for you having to do it yourself.
Yep. If you can't see it, you can't manage it, right? Okay. So do you want to wrap us up, Maggie, or should I go ahead?
Yeah, so thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. We know everybody's really busy. If you liked what you saw and you want to get some one-on-one evaluation, some one-on-one help, feel free to contact me. My email's up on the screen right now, and I will get you hooked up with our workshops. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much, Ryan and Jay.
Have a good day, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Take care, all.